Today, June 12th, something in the fabric of your life cracked open. Not gradually, not as a slow dawning, but all at once. At the exact moment this transit perfected in the sky. You didn't choose this moment. This moment chose you. And the way it arrived, not through a dramatic event, but through a sudden, bone-deep clarity about something you have been walking around for months, means it came from somewhere more precise than circumstance. The shattering you are feeling right now is not a breakdown. It is a reveal. What just broke was not your life. It was the story you had been telling yourself about why the path you've been avoiding was somehow not yours to take. And that distinction between what shattered and what got freed is the difference between a crisis and a completion. You are here because something in you already knew today was different before you had language for why. Not the algorithm, not coincidence. Something that has been watching the shape of your life and decided it was time for you to see what you have been walking past. Subscribe and like this video and write in the comments, "I'm ready to walk it." Not as a wish, as a declaration. Your nervous system is signing in for what comes next, because what comes next requires you to be fully awake. And you already feel the difference between today and yesterday. The ground under your feet feels different, not less stable, but differently stable. Like you have stopped standing on something borrowed and realized you've been standing on something that was always yours. What most people don't understand about a breakpoint is that the breaking is not the problem. It is the delivery system. The universe does not shatter things that are still serving you. It only breaks what has been holding you in place while pretending to be a floor. You stood on something that felt solid. Today it turned out to be a ceiling you had been pressing against from below. And the moment it cracked, the space above it became available. This is not loss. This is geometry. There is a specific kind of person this transit reaches. Not everyone who watches this will feel what you feel right now. This is not a transmission for people who are comfortable. It is a transmission for people who did the work in private. Not for applause, not for confirmation, not because anything in the external world was rewarding them for it, and kept going anyway. People who continued refining, continued examining, continued building clarity about what they wanted, even when the conditions around them were actively arguing against the wanting. Think about a fork you came to at some point in the last year. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. The kind that existed inside an ordinary afternoon where the easier direction was completely available to you. Nobody was watching. Nothing was forcing you toward the harder one. You could have taken the path that asked less, required less honesty, demanded less of you. You could have settled into the available version of what you wanted, rather than continuing to hold out for the real one. But something in you registered, without language, without ceremony, that the easier direction would cost you something you weren't willing to trade. So you chose the other one. And then you lived in the silence of that choice, unconfirmed, unwitnessed, with no signal from outside that you had chosen correctly. Nobody handed you credit for that. The path didn't immediately open to confirm you were right. The external world continued more or less as before, offering no particular evidence that the harder choice had been the real one. You held it anyway. That moment, that quiet fork, that private choice made without an audience, is the exact credential this door requires. What shattered today was not your safety. What shattered was the last reason you were giving yourself to stay at the edge of the path instead of walking it. Here is what happened in the sky today, and why it matters to your actual life right now. The planetary force that governs where things get stripped to their truth, Pluto, has been moving through the sign that rules new beginnings, primal forward motion, and the raw nerve of self-assertion. Pluto is not a soft planet. It is not the kind of energy that suggests a change and then leaves you to consider it at your own pace. It is the force that removes everything that is not real. Everything that was borrowed, constructed, or maintained because it was socially useful rather than genuinely true. Pluto does not argue with any of it. It simply withdraws the conditions that were holding it up, and you watch it fall. Pluto in Aries means that question, what is actually you, and what here is a role you built to avoid finding out, is being asked specifically about your identity and your direction. Not who you say you are at a dinner party. Not who you are when you're being evaluated. Who you are when nobody is expecting anything from you. When there is no performance required. When the only standard is your own interior compass. That is what Pluto in Aries is interested in. And it has been working on this for months. At the same time, the Sun and Mercury are now moving into a direct alignment with that Pluto force. And this is where today becomes different from the last several months of pressure. The Sun is you, your vitality, your fundamental sense of direction, the thing that makes you feel alive when it's aligned and depleted when it isn't. Mercury is the part of you that translates knowing into language, that takes what you feel in the body and forms it into something you can actually act on. When both of these make contact with Pluto, something that has been building underground for months reaches the surface. The comfortable explanations you've been running about why the bold path is for someone else, why this isn't the right time, why you need one more preparation cycle before you're ready, why wanting this so clearly might mean something is wrong with your judgment. Those explanations cannot survive this alignment. Not because you finally argued back against them, because the planetary force that dissolves comfortable fictions is now shining a direct line of light through the exact window where those fictions live. What this combination produces in the body is specific. It is not fear exactly. It is something that feels like fear, but functions differently. Where fear contracts, this expands. Where fear says, not yet, this says, you have been ready and you knew it. The sensation is precise. Something you have been holding at a slight angle, presenting to the world slightly sideways, not quite full on, keeping the truest version of what you want at a small, protective distance from full exposure, is being asked to face forward, not gently, clearly. This is not the universe punishing you for the time it took. This is the universe running out of patience with the part of you that was doing the delaying and redirecting that energy, all of it, toward what actually wants to move. This portal does not open for people who merely want change. Wanting change is nearly universal. What this specific transit activates is something more precise. The person who has been in a sustained, unrewarded relationship with their own direction, who has kept working on the internal clarity, kept refining the vision, kept choosing toward the real thing even when the real thing produced no external feedback that the choosing was right, and who has done this long enough that the vision is no longer aspirational. It is simply true. There is a kind of moment that belongs to this category of person. A moment when the comfortable version of the story about your own life was right there, fully available, easier to live with, something you could have told yourself and been believed. And you looked at the real version instead. The real version that named what you actually want, without the softening qualifiers, without the built-in hedge against disappointment. Holding that truth costs something. Not a dramatic cost, not a visible one. The quiet, persistent cost of carrying what you know, when knowing it doesn't come with permission to act on it yet. That was not wasted time. That was the right lesson arriving in the only form it can take to become permanent. That was not the wrong path or the wrong moment crossing your life at the wrong time. That was the right lesson. What you went through in the period of unrewarded clarity was not you being made to wait for something you deserved sooner. That was not being left on the outside of your own life. That was an edit. The universe quietly revising the manuscript of what's next from a story about someone preparing for their path, into a story about someone who has arrived at its threshold without losing anything essential along the way. What you are carrying now, the knowing that you can no longer unknow, the clarity that arrived the moment the last excuse dissolved, is not a burden. It is a credential. The person standing at the threshold of this portal is not triumphant, not loud, not certain in a showy way. They are simply grounded. They know where they are, and where they are is exactly here, which is exactly where this door opens. Here is what the period before today was actually protecting. If this clarity had arrived 6 months ago, if the shattering had happened before you had done what you've done in the intervening window, you would have arrived at the path still needing it to answer something inside you that hadn't been answered yet, still carrying the unresolved question of your own worth, your own readiness, your own right to take up the full space of what you want. And you would have brought that question with you into the new beginning. You would have walked onto the bold path and immediately begun looking to the path itself to settle what the path was never designed to settle. What happens when you bring an unresolved question of worth into a new beginning is this. The new beginning becomes about that question. Every obstacle becomes evidence you were right to doubt yourself. Every difficulty becomes proof the path wasn't really yours. Every setback becomes confirmation of the version of the story that said, "Not you, not yet." The path gets filtered through a wound that was never about the path at all. And eventually, the path stops feeling like direction and starts feeling like another place where you are being asked to prove something. What arrives today can be received as direction rather than confirmation. Not, "This proves I was right to wait." Not, "This proves I was worthy after all." Simply, "This is the path. I see it. I am ready to walk it." Not because everything is settled in every area of my life, but because I am no longer asking the path to settle it for me. The question of worth is not on the table. It was removed from the table, quietly, without announcement, somewhere in the months between then and now. The waiting is finished, not because enough calendar time passed, but because you became someone for whom the old reasons to wait genuinely no longer apply. There is no version of the next honest conversation you have with yourself that ends with, "I'm still not ready." That sentence has lost its grip on you, not because you convinced yourself out of it, because it is no longer true. And you know the difference between a truth and a habit. This is why the silence before the breakpoint lasted as long as it did. Saturn, the planetary force that governs what gets made real and lasting, what gets built properly versus what gets built too fast to hold, does not open a door until both the lesson and the person are genuinely ready to pass through it. Not ready in theory, ready in the body. Ready in the choices you make when no one is watching and nothing is confirming that those choices matter. You met that standard. And today, the door opens not as a reward, but as a consequence of what is now simply true. The old pattern inside you, the one that has been managing your relationship with this path for longer than you'd like to admit, is not stupid, and it deserves to be understood before it's released. It built itself for real reasons. It constructed a perfectly reasonable set of arguments for why stepping fully into what you want would be premature, risky, possibly arrogant, probably unrealistic. And it had evidence, real evidence, past moments where you reached for something and the conditions weren't ready. Moments where visible ambition was met with skepticism, where wanting clearly was interpreted as naivety, where the full declaration of what you were moving toward got received in a way that made you understand the cost of being that exposed before you were ready to absorb it. So the pattern learned. It didn't suppress the knowing. Suppression is too crude, and you were too smart for it. Instead, it became a rationalizer. It sat down next to what you knew and offered measured, calm, reasonable explanations for why acting on it didn't make sense quite yet. Not the right conditions. Let things settle a bit more. There will be a better moment for this. And each time you agreed, the agreement felt responsible. It felt like perspective. It felt like evidence that you were taking the whole thing seriously enough to do it correctly, rather than rushing. But here is what the rationalizer's explanations have been doing for the last several months specifically. They have been taking longer to rebuild. Each time the knowing arrived, cleaner, louder, carrying more of your actual body weight behind it, the rationalizer has had to work harder to construct a counter-argument that held. The gap between the recognition and the next explanation for why not has been shrinking visibly. You have felt it. The moments when you almost just said yes. When you almost stopped qualifying the want. When you almost simply moved without pre-filing all the paperwork. Those moments have been arriving faster than the arguments could keep up with them. Today, the construction failed. Not because you finally won the argument. Because this transit removed the raw material the rationalizer needed to keep building. The explanations are still there as shapes, available as words, as familiar patterns of thought. But they no longer carry weight. You can think them and feel them land hollow. The way you feel the hollowness of a word you've said so many times, it has temporarily lost its meaning. That hollowness is not emptiness. It is the specific sound of a function that has run out of purpose. The recognition doesn't ask your old pattern's permission. It arrived, it is real, and it is already changing the calculation, whether or not the pattern has acknowledged it yet. You are standing between two ways of moving through what comes next. From the outside, they look almost identical. Same person, same circumstances, same path sitting in front of you, equally visible from both positions. The difference is entirely interior, and it is the whole game. No one is watching this moment. That is exactly what makes it the most important one. One way moves from grip. It is the version that needs to control the shape of what happens next, that needs to know, before taking the first step, that the path is guaranteed, that the outcome is secured, that the risk has been assessed and reduced to a level that feels manageable. This version is not afraid in a surface way. It is managing. There is a specific sensation to it, and if you have been in it, you know it from the inside. The background process that never fully stops. The low-level monitoring of every variable that might require an adjustment. The part of the mind that is always already 3 steps ahead, preparing for the next wave of difficulty before the current one has finished arriving. It is exhausting in a way that has become so familiar it no longer registers as exhaustion. It just feels like being responsible. Like being careful with something that matters. What it doesn't feel like, and this is the part that is harder to name, is alive. The other way moves from something that the managing version doesn't have access to. Not recklessness. Not the abandonment of discernment. Precision. It is the version that allows the situation to reveal its own shape, rather than imposing a predetermined shape upon it. That can take the first step without knowing the 10th. That has done enough internal work to tell the difference between a genuine signal about actual danger and a habit of bracing that developed when danger was more reliably present than it is now. This version doesn't grip, it opens. And the quality of that opening is not naive. It is informed by everything the first version worked through and integrated. What makes this moment unusual is not the feeling. You have stood at this kind of fork before. What makes it unusual is who is feeling it now. The person standing here now has access to the second version in a way the person who stood at previous forks did not. Ask yourself this, not as a thought to evaluate, but as a question you lower into the body and let settle there. Am I managing the next step, or am I finally allowing it? That question, held in the body rather than analyzed in the mind, will show you exactly where you actually are, not where you intended to be, not where you hope you are, where you are. Every path you've been avoiding carries a soul contract inside it, not a romantic arrangement, not a vague invitation to become more. A precise agreement about what must be confronted, what must be integrated, what must become undeniably true about you before the next chapter of your life can begin. Soul contracts are not soft things. They are specific. They do not end when you've suffered enough, or waited long enough, or earned enough external validation to feel ready. They end when the lesson is genuinely integrated, not performed, not quoted back correctly, but actually lived into, in the body. In the choices you make when the old pattern is available and you reach past it anyway. The contract at the center of this breakpoint is about boundaries of self. Not the shallow version of that phrase, not the lists, not the policies, not the careful management of who gets access to what. The deeper thing, where you end and the world's expectations of you begin. The specific, often invisible difference between your genuine desires and the desires you have inherited from what you were taught was realistic, appropriate, achievable, safe for someone with your particular starting conditions. The contract came to teach you to locate the precise line where you are fully yourself, and to stop treating that line as something to negotiate away, apologize for, or sand down to a size that makes other people more comfortable with your wanting. This is what this specific connection to the avoided path has been working on inside you. It has not been comfortable. The lesson of knowing where you end and expectations begin requires you to stand in a moment when something outside you is fully confident about what you should want, and remain in clear, honest contact with what you actually want. Those two things can feel so different from each other that choosing the real one can feel almost antisocial. It can feel like arrogance or ingratitude, or an unnecessary disruption of things that could have been easier. The cost of choosing the real want in a field that expected a different one is real, and it has been paid repeatedly, without ceremony. The grief of seeing this contract clearly is also real. It means looking back and recognizing the moments when you shaped yourself to fit what was expected rather than what was true. The moments when you made the want smaller or safer or less inconvenient to others, not because you believed in the diminishment, but because the social cost of the full-sized version felt, in those specific moments, too high. That version of you was not weak. It was human. It did what it knew how to do with what it had available at the time. But it has completed its work now. And the grief for what was compressed is also the signal that you know, clearly, what was real. The contract did not promise an outcome. It promised a change in who you are, and that promise has already been kept. What remains is not a question of whether you have genuinely changed. The change is not something you are still waiting to achieve. It is not something you will recognize after one more confirmation. It is here. It is what is standing at this threshold right now. What remains is only the question of whether you are ready to live from the change that already happened. To stop treating the new version of yourself as a proposal and start treating it as a fact. What ends here is not the wanting. What ends is the version of the path that could only exist while the lesson was still unfinished. The version where the wanting was always slightly hedged, slightly apologetic, never quite at full volume. The wanting, if it was real, does not require the old dynamic to survive. It only required you to become someone who would stop drowning it out. Your body already received this before your mind formed the words for it. And it has been showing you evidence for days, possibly weeks, through signals you may have been only half reading, attributing to other causes, filing as coincidence. The way you move through a room has changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that others would necessarily name if asked. But something about the space you take up has extended, slightly and unmistakably, toward your actual dimensions. You are no longer arranging yourself around the periphery of your own life, making sure the wanting is not too visible, that you're not taking up more space than you're certain you've earned. The arrangement has loosened. The posture of holding yourself back just slightly from the full declaration, that has started giving way to something that feels, at first, almost uncomfortably forward. Not aggressive, present. The quality of a sentence that used to end in a qualification now sometimes ends cleanly. You begin to articulate what you want, and the usual escort of caveats doesn't arrive. Not every time. But it is happening, and you notice it when it does. Not with pride exactly, but with a slight, quiet surprise. The way you notice a habit you didn't know you'd broken until the moment it fails to materialize. The things that occupy the background of your awareness have shifted. The low hum of self-editing, the constant minor recalibration to ensure you're presenting yourself in a way that won't be received as too much, too certain, too far in the direction of what you actually want, has gotten quieter. And in the space that opened, something else is becoming audible. It is not a new voice. It is your actual one, minus the adjustments that were never really yours to begin with. The vision of what you want, the path you have been circling without landing in, no longer arrives in your awareness with the same companion sense of its own impossibility, where it once felt like something you were observing from outside a window, real, visible, but separated from you by something you couldn't quite name. It now occupies the same space as your body, not fully in your hands yet, but no longer behind glass. The shift is not dramatic. It lives in the fraction of a second before the thought forms. The moment where, for the first time, there is nothing bracing behind it. Something has changed in how desire itself sits in your body. This is area 4 of the new timeline locking in, not urgency versus trust as a concept you can describe, but a real, felt, physical difference in the quality of what happens in the body when you think about what you want. 6 months ago, wanting something clearly felt like a risk. The clarity itself carried danger, because clarity without pre-approval, without some signal from the external world that you were allowed to want this much, this specifically, this unapologetically, felt like exposure. So the wanting came with a correction built in. You would feel the desire arrive and immediately begin the management process, qualifying it, proportioning it, building the case for why it was a reasonable want before anyone had even asked you to justify it. The desire and its own defense brief arrived together. Always, without separation, always in the same breath. What is different now is not the size of what you want. It is the absence of the defense brief. The want arrives and it sits there, clean, unqualified, not arguing for itself. And at first that absence reads as something wrong. Surely something should be justifying this. Surely the clarity shouldn't just be allowed to exist by itself, without an escort to make it acceptable. The habit of apology runs so deep that its absence initially feels like negligence rather than freedom. But this is not negligence. This is your body finally trusting what it knows. The reaching quality, the posture of wanting that always had a slight forward lean, an anticipatory apology built into its shape, a quality of asking whether the want was allowed before it had even fully arrived, is giving way to something that sits level. The want is yours. It does not need to earn the right to be yours before you are allowed to feel it fully. It does not need to demonstrate its proportionality before you are allowed to move toward it. That is a different relationship with your own desire than anything you have been inside before. And the body registers the difference even when the mind is still catching up to what it means. Where it once said, "I hope I'm allowed to want this," it now simply says, "This is what I want." Where it once felt like reaching towards something that might pull away, it now feels like turning towards something that has been there all along, waiting for you to stop looking slightly to the side of it. The part of you that needed external confirmation to feel certain about its own direction has completed its work. What remains does not require reflection to stay real. It simply is. That is not a small change. That is the whole change. After an activation like this one, certain things become structurally unavailable to your nervous system. Not as a decision you made, not as a position you are taking, but as a biological fact about what the body will and will not move toward. You don't choose this. You discover it. And the discovery feels less like empowerment and more like recognition. Oh, this is just true now. You will find that you can no longer be held at emotional arm's length by your own life. The part of you that was comfortable with vagueness about your direction, with someday, with when things settle, with the habitual almost readiness that always required one more condition to be met before the path could be fully walked. That comfort has dissolved, not because you worked hard to dissolve it, because the system has been recalibrated, and that position no longer fits the body that has come through what you've come through. You will also find that you can no longer carry the full weight of a vision alone while spending the majority of your energy in conditions that actively contradict it. The specific internal friction of knowing clearly what you want while moving through spaces that require you to want less, that friction has crossed a threshold. Where it once felt like discipline, like mature patience, like doing your time before the path opened, it now reads as signal. The body registers the mismatch the way it registers a note that is slightly off from where it should be. Immediately, physically, before the mind has time to evaluate whether the response is appropriate. The third thing that stops being tolerable is the version of yourself that explains your vision to people who are using the explanation as evidence that it's too much. The version that softens the want to make it sound reasonable to someone who has already decided to find it unreasonable. The version that keeps producing justifications for a direction that no longer needs justifying to you. That explaining is finished, not with hostility, not with a declaration, but with the quiet, settled recognition that the conversation has simply run its course. There is nothing left to defend. The path is not a proposal awaiting approval. It is a direction your body is already facing. What other people make of that is, from this point on, genuinely not your assignment. You did not close yourself. You clarified. And clarity does not reduce what is possible. It removes what was never going to be real anyway, and makes the remaining space available for what actually is. Whether the bold path you've been avoiding arrives all at once or in stages. Whether the first step leads immediately to confirmation or first to a kind of beautiful, productive uncertainty. Your wholeness is no longer contingent on the arrival. This is what this breakpoint completed inside you. Not a philosophy you are choosing to adopt when it feels convenient. A fact about what you are now built from, whether the external world confirms it today or not. When something genuinely new enters your field after this, a real opportunity, a real situation that carries the frequency of what you've been moving toward, you will receive it differently than you have received things before. The question it will face is not, does this feel good? Feeling good is not the standard anymore. The question it will face is more precise than that. Does this arrive already making sense, or does it require me to talk myself into it? That distinction between the thing that lands and the thing that requires convincing is the new standard. And it is not high in an exclusionary way. It is simply accurate. Things that genuinely belong in the next chapter will not require you to negotiate with your own intuition about whether they are right. They will simply be legible. The clarity will be immediate, physical, not dependent on the thing not having any challenges or difficulties. What makes it legible is not that it's easy. It's that it's honest. That it is asking the real version of you to show up, not the qualified version. And the things that don't meet that standard, the opportunities that require you to compress back to a previous version to make them work. The situations that ask you to explain your direction as though it needs permission. You will feel the mismatch before you have language for it. Not dramatically, quietly. A subtle but definite recognition, the way the body registers that it has walked into a room where the air is different. Not wrong, not dangerous. Just not the room, not anymore. Both outcomes, what arrives and what doesn't, confirm the same thing. The story does not end differently depending on what shows up next. It continues, from the same ground, with the same clarity, toward the same direction. That is what changed. That is all that needed to. If something in this reached you somewhere that has been waiting to be reached, not just your mind, but the part of you that knows things before it has words for them, do one thing right now. Like this video, not as a gesture, as a signal to yourself that you are present for this. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. These transmissions build on each other. What opens today connects directly to what arrives in the next window. And in the comments, write, "My path is clear." Say it out loud as you type it, for your own nervous system. Words spoken with real meaning complete something that silent reading leaves unfinished. And if someone in your life is standing at a threshold they can't quite name, share this with them. Your soul already knows who. The bold path you have been avoiding is not new. It has been there the whole time, precisely as real and precisely as available as it is today. What changed today is not the path. What changed is the last thing standing between you and it. The final, carefully maintained set of reasons why not just gave way. Not under the pressure of your wanting, under the weight of what you have quietly become across the months and forks and private choices that brought you here. Today you don't become a different person. You become the person who stops walking around what they already know. You face the direction your body has been facing for months. You take one step, not a leap, not a proclamation, not a burning of bridges, just a single, honest, unhesitating step from the ground you are actually standing on. The path doesn't require you to announce it. It only requires you to move. And from here, you simply continue. Forward. Without the drag of everything you were never really going to carry forever. Toward what was always there, waiting not for you to deserve it, but for you to stop pretending